When I first moved into my neighborhood, I thought it would be the kind of place where people minded their own business. The houses were clean, the lawns were manicured, and the HOA promised to maintain community harmony. That sounded good to me. I wasn't looking for trouble. I just wanted to live in peace, keep my lawn nice, and enjoy my weekends without drama. But little did I know, living 2 houses down was a woman who thrived on conflict, and she was about to make me her next target. It all started with my lawn decorations. Nothing crazy, just a couple of garden gnomes, a solar light path, and a small wooden sign with a friendly message. To me, it made the yard feel welcoming, something that gave the house character. To Karen, however, it was apparently a crime against the neighborhood's aesthetic. She marched around like she owned the street, and when she saw my yard, it was like I had personally offended her existence. At first, I ignored her constant glaring. Every time I mow my lawn, she'd stand outside, pretending to water her flowers, but really just watching me like a hawk. Then came the letters. Anonymous, of course, but the handwriting and tone were so obvious it couldn't have been anyone but her. She claimed my lawn was tacky, bringing down property values, and non-compliant with HOA rules. The thing was, I had actually read the bylaws before I moved in, and I knew for a fact that my decorations didn't violate anything. The HOA allowed modest personal lawn displays, and that's exactly what I had. Still, Karen escalated. She began calling the HOA every week, complaining about me. I'd get emails from a board saying they'd received a complaint, but found no issue upon inspection. That only seemed to fuel her anger. She wanted me gone, or at least humiliated enough to submit to her demands. And when the HOA didn't do her bidding, she decided to take matters into her own hands. One Saturday afternoon, I was in my backyard when I heard sirens. At first, I thought something serious had happened nearby, but then the police car stopped right in front of my house. My stomach dropped. I had never had the police show up at my door before, and I couldn't imagine why they would. That's when I saw Karen standing on her porch with her arms crossed, smirking like she had just won the lottery. She had actually called the cops over lawn decorations. The officers were professional, of course. They looked at my yard, saw the harmless gnomes and lights, and realized immediately that this was nothing more than a neighbor's petty complaint. After a quick chat, they left, probably rolling their eyes all the way down the street. To me, it was embarrassing, but to Karen, it was a power play. She wanted to prove she could bring trouble to my doorstep anytime she wanted. For a moment, I considered just removing the decorations. Not because I thought she was right, but because I didn't want the constant hassle. But then I remembered, people like Karen don't stop when you give them what they want. If I took down the gnomes, she'd come after my mailbox. If I repainted my fence, she'd find a new problem. Giving in wasn't an option. If I wanted peace, I had to stand my ground. That's when I decided to start digging. I pulled out the HOA handbook again and studied it line by line. I wanted to make sure I was completely in the clear, and I was. But something else caught my eye, a section on structural modifications. According to the bylaws, any permanent home addition required not only HOA approval, but also proper city permits. That's when I remembered something about Karen's house. A few months before, she had added a large sunroom to the back of her property. I remembered because she had made a huge deal out of it, bragging about how much it increased her home value. But I also remembered overhearing a neighbor mention that Karen didn't bother with all the paperwork. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. Now, though, it felt like a puzzle piece falling into place. I decided to do some research. A quick trip to the county records office confirmed what I suspected. There were no permits filed for the sunroom. That meant it was an unapproved structure, one that violated both city regulations and the HOA bylaws she loved to weaponize against everyone else. Suddenly, the power dynamic shifted. She had spent weeks trying to paint me as the problem, but in reality, she was the one in serious violation. I didn't act right away. I knew I needed to be careful. Karen was the type of person who would cause as much chaos as possible if she even sensed I was onto her. Instead, I quietly gathered every piece of evidence I could find, screenshots of HOA rules, a copy of the county's permit records, and photos of her sunroom. I was building a case, not just for myself, but for the moment when her hypocrisy could be exposed for everyone to see. Meanwhile, Karen continued her harassment. She started leaving nasty notes taped to my mailbox. She whispered to other neighbors about how trashy my lawn was. She even started taking pictures of my yard and sending them to the HOA, hoping they'd finally turn against me. Every attempt failed, and each failure only made her more unhinged. By this point, the neighborhood was starting to notice. Some of the neighbors gave me sympathetic looks, clearly aware of Karen's antics. Others avoided me, not wanting to get caught in the middle of the feud. But all of them were watching, and I realized that when the truth came out, it wasn't just going to be between me and Karen. It was going to be a spectacle. The final straw came when Karen stood in the middle of the street one evening, pointing at my yard and loudly declaring that people like me didn't belong here. That was the moment I knew it was time to act. I had the proof. I had the bylaws. And I had the determination to turn the tables once and for all. The next morning, I sent everything I had collected straight to the HOA board. I wasn't sure how long it would take for them to respond, but I knew I had just lit a fuse under Karen's carefully built empire of intimidation. And sure enough, it didn't take long before the board called an emergency meeting. Karen thought she was walking in to finally get me punished. But what happened instead would shake the entire neighborhood and leave her with nowhere to hide. The night of the HOA meeting arrived, and the tension in the neighborhood was thicker than ever. Word had already spread that something big was about to go down. Meetings were usually dull affairs about landscaping budgets and recycling reminders, but this one was different. The whispers were everywhere. People knew that Karen had been stirring the pot for weeks, and they knew I had finally decided to push back. No one knew the details, but everyone was eager to see what would unfold. The community center was packed. Folding chairs lined the room. Neighbors murmured to each other in hushed voices, and at the front sat the board members with their stacks of papers. Karen strutted in like she was the star of the show, wearing that smug expression that said she thought she had already won. She believed this was going to be the moment when I was forced to apologize, when my ugly lawn would finally be condemned, and when she could claim her victory as the self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood. But she didn't know what I had brought with me. I wasn't coming in defenseless. I had documents, records, and undeniable proof that the Queen of Complaints was standing on a legal ground. The meeting began with the usual motions, but everyone was just waiting for the drama. Finally, the board chair addressed the elephant in the room, a resident complaint regarding lawn decorations. All eyes turned to me and then to Karen. She sat up straighter, her lips curling into a satisfied grin. The board explained that they had reviewed my decorations multiple times and found no violation of the bylaws. That alone should have been the end of it, but Karen wasn't ready to let go. She jumped in, her voice dripping with superiority, declaring that the board was ignoring the integrity of the community and that my property was bringing shame to the neighborhood. The arrogance in her tone made it clear. She thought she was untouchable, and that was the moment I struck. Calmly, I presented my folder of evidence. I reminded the board of their own bylaws regarding structural modifications. Then I laid down the county records showing that Karen's massive sunroom had never been approved, never been permitted, and was in direct violation of both HOA rules and city codes. The room fell silent. The smugness drained from Karen's face like water from a sinking ship. Gasps echoed across the chairs. Neighbors leaned forward, whispering in disbelief. The woman who had spent months policing everyone else's property was now exposed as the biggest violator of them all. The board members flipped through the documents, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock to frustration. It was clear they couldn't ignore this. Karen tried to defend herself, insisting it was a misunderstanding, claiming she thought the paperwork had been handled. But the records were black and white. There was no permit, no approval, no excuse. The board reminded her that unapproved structures were not a minor infraction. They were a serious violation that could carry heavy fines, mandatory removal, and even legal consequences. Suddenly, the power she had wielded so confidently was gone. The neighbors who once tolerated her antics were now staring at her with judgment and disgust. For so long, She had tried to control everyone else's lives, but now the spotlight was on her. And it wasn't flattering. The board adjourned with a ruling that Karen had 30 days to either apply for proper permits, which, given the structure's size and location, was unlikely to be approved, or remove the sunroom entirely. On top of that, she was fined heavily for months of noncompliance. It was a devastating blow, but it was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the fallout was brutal. Karen stormed through the neighborhood, ranting about conspiracies and claiming she was being targeted. But the truth was undeniable. The fines piled up, the city inspectors got involved, and her once prized sunroom was officially declared illegal. Neighbors who had once ignored her antics began to avoid her altogether. The same people she had bullied were now relieved to see her finally facing consequences. Meanwhile, I kept my lawn exactly the way it was. The gnomes stood proudly, the solar lights glowed at night, and the wooden sign greeted passers-by with a friendly message. Every time I watered my grass, I noticed how much lighter the neighborhood felt. Without Karen breathing down everyone's necks, people actually started talking to each other again. A couple down the street even added their own decorations, something they had been too afraid to do before. My small act of resistance had sparked a quiet rebellion against a reign of pettiness. But Karen's downfall didn't stop at fines and shame. The costs of removing the sunroom were staggering. She tried to fight the board, tried to fight the city, but the law was on the side of the documents I had uncovered. With no other choice, she was forced to dismantle her beloved addition, leaving her property scarred and her pride shattered. The financial burden, combined with the loss of face, pushed her to the breaking point. Within months, Karen put her house up for sale. No one was surprised. She couldn't stand living in the neighborhood where her power had been stripped away, where her reputation was ruined, and where everyone saw her for what she really was. Eventually, a moving truck pulled up to her driveway, and just like that, she was gone. The day she left was almost like a holiday. Neighbors gathered outside, not to mock her, but to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The street felt different without her constant negativity. People smiled more, chatted more, and actually began to enjoy the community for what it was meant to be, a place to live peacefully, not a battlefield controlled by one person's obsession with power. Looking back, it still amazes me how far things escalated, all over a few harmless lawn decorations. Karen thought she could bully me into submission, but in trying to take me down, she exposed her own flaws and brought about her own downfall. The HOA, the neighbors, even the city, all of them saw the truth, and in the end, she lost everything she had tried so desperately to control. My lawn is still the same today, gnomes and all. But now, when I look at it, I don't just see a few decorations. I see a reminder that sometimes standing your ground is worth it, that bullies only have power if you let them, and that even the loudest, most controlling voices can crumble when faced with the truth. Karen thought she could use the system against me. Instead, the system turned on her. She wanted to destroy my peace of mind. Instead, she destroyed her own. And in the end, the neighborhood was better off without her.